Hello and welcome to my tutorial on dForce Basics. dForce is the physics simulation engine of Daz Studio, which was introduced about a year ago in October 2017. By now we're seeing more and more dForce clothing in the stores and on various freebie sites, but I know that not everyone is familiar with dForce yet. So if that is the case for you, I hope this tutorial will help you getting started. It's really a lot of fun. I'm going to show you the basics, the various methods how to run a dForce simulation, and I'm also going to show you a few tips and tricks and some methods how to solve problems you might run into with a dForce clothing. So even if you've already used dForce a few times, you might find something useful in this tutorial. I'm using Daz Studio version 4.11, and if you're still on version 4.10, which was the first Daz Studio version with dForce, I strongly recommend that you upgrade, because dForce has improved a lot. It's much more stable now, it has less errors, it drapes faster, and generally it's much more stable now than it was in the very first edition. If you have problems with your hardware, if you have got problems getting it to work, I recommend that you go to the forum, the Start Here thread in this address here, and that's 3d.com forums. In software, Daz Studio discussion, there is a thread called dForce Start Here. It's one of the sticky threads, and you will find some technical explanations and also some explanations about the technical requirements and some links to the drivers. If you have a newer computer, it should run out of the box. If it doesn't, you can find the solutions here in this thread. Right, so let's assume that everything is set up correctly and we can get started with our first simulation now. In my scene here I have Genesis 8 female with my summer dream dress, which is a very good starting point for dForce because it's easy to use and it drapes quite fast. First, you need to know that dForce by default collides with everything in the scene. I know that some other software with similar systems require you to set the simulation for each piece, whether it collides or not. dForce is easier. By default, it collides with everything that is visible in your scene. So, if you've got anything else like hair or a scene around you, you should go and hide these other things because it will only slow down the simulation. So for example, I go here and the female eyelashes, I could hide them. That means that dForce will ignore them in the simulation. Or there is another option. You can go to the parameters, to the display section here, and we have this visible in simulation option here, and by default it's on. We can switch it to off. This has the same effect, just that you don't hide it in the scene, so it will, if it's hidden, you won't see it in the render either. So you can keep it visible, so that means it will be rendered, but it will be ignored in the dForce simulation. You can use either option, make it invisible, or use this option here. It depends on your scene or what seems more practical to you. Right, so how do we go about starting the simulation? To make it look better, we need to apply a pose to the figure. So I select my figure and I go to my pose collection, and I'm going to use one of the base poses. Let's say this one. Right. And then I go to the Simulation Settings tab. If you don't have this tab on your screen, you can open it here in Windows, Panes, Tabs, and it's this one, Simulation Settings. And for our first run, we leave everything in default settings. We don't have to change anything right now. We just use this colored button here, Simulate, and you can see that the pose switches to the default pose and then moves slowly into position for the final pose. And this happens because this option here is selected. The Start Bones from Memorized Pose is on. The memorized pose by default is the standard pose, the default pose. And it uses that as a starting point and moves the figure into the final pose. And it does the draping of the fabric in between. Now at the end it adds another phase, stabilizing simulation, and now it's finished. This hasn't been even a minute. So, and we have our draped dress. Another method would be, and it would be even quicker, that we don't use this Start Bones from Memorized Pose, but that doesn't always work. Let's see why. I'm going to clear the simulation now with this button here, but be aware that this button clears the simulation of all items in your scene. So if you have figures with different dForce dresses, this will clear all the simulations. If you want to clear only one particular item, you need to select the clothing item, and you go here, dForce, clear dForce simulation from selected items. I have made myself a shortcut for this. Okay. So now we still have the figure in this pose, and I switch this off, and now let's see what happens. In this case it should work quite well. It means that it doesn't start from the memorized pose, from the default pose. It starts right in this state where it is. So that can be an advantage. It produces different results, as you can see, because the legs stayed in this position, they didn't move, so the draping of the skirt here is different. It depends on the effect you want, whether you can use that or not. A little warning, this method doesn't work with all poses, because when the pose is more complicated, when the figure moves more than just twisting a little and moving the leg a little, then this shortcut procedure is not enough. Then you won't get good results, or it might even cause a so-called explosion. And we're going into that right now, what that means. Okay, let's use a different pose. For example, from the classic appeal pack, and let's use this one. Okay, so just switch that on again and hit simulate. And now I'm going to get a problem. I can see this area here, and I see that this moves much slower than it did before. Let's give it a few more seconds. Exactly. Now all I can do is hit cancel, because this is one of the so-called dForce explosions. And you can see it really looks like an explosion. Because that happens when dForce runs into a problem and it doesn't know what to do, so it moves the fabric in all directions at once, it seems. And this is the result. So just hit clear and let's see why that happened. One thing is, I noticed during the simulation that I have an issue with the hand here. So let's just hide the dress for a moment and look at this more closely. The hand is not sticking in the body, because that is one problem that dForce really can't handle. When body parts are sticking into each other, for example, this hand is so close to the hip that it's half buried in the hip, that would mean that the fabric had to move inside the figure, and that is something dForce can't do. That's one case which will give you such an explosion. But here we even have a tiny bit of space between the fingers and the body. You can see there is a very small offset, but this would be enough to have a layer of fabric in between. So that's not the problem. So what is it? We don't really see it here, but there is a way to find out, and that is to use a different simulation method. We're not going to use the current frame method, but I'm switching it to animated, and that means use timeline play range, and I need my timeline. So I go to Window, Paints or Tabs, and I open my timeline here. Here we are. This is used to set up an animation, and even if you want to render only a still render and not an animated video, you can still use that for better dForce draping and for better control. The theory is that you start at frame 0, that is right at the beginning of the animation, that is called frame 0, and you have the default setting of 30 frames, and you move to the middle to frame 15, let's say. Here it gives you the current frame number, and you apply your pose here. Now in this case we have already our pose in frame 0, because we had the pose already applied before we opened up the timeline. So what can we do? I select the root entry of the figure in my scene tab, and I go to my options menu and I go to expand all. And now I have this selected, and I scroll down all the way, and she has a lot of bones, right to the right pectoral, which is the last bone in this list. We don't need to select the eyelashes or the dress. We select just the bones of the figure, and we use this symbol here, the key with a plus. That means add a keyframe. It takes a while. Here we go. Now the program has saved all the settings for all the selected bones, which is all bones in the figure, and it remembers them for this point in these 30 frames. Now I can go here and I go to, no sorry, not in the scene tab, in the parameters tab, 0 figure. Okay, so she's back in 0 pose. And when I move this now, I have the pose that I have set for the frame 15. This is a keyframe, and the frame 0 is a keyframe, and the keyframes have these black triangles underneath in the timeline. That means here and here something is happening to the figure. The frames in between are an automatic transition. And we can see what happens. We notice a few things. Let's focus on the hand, because this was the problem area previously, and this is what we need to fix. So let's zoom in a bit. And when I move this yellow slider along the timeline, this is a good method to control the velocity yourself, so you can really see what's going on. And the hand gets closer to the body. And this is the problem. The thumb is deeply inside the hip. So this is what causes the problem in the dForce simulation, because the start bones from memorized pose feature means that dForce starts in this pose and it moves to this final pose, and what happens in between is this. We just didn't see it previously, but now we can see what happens because we've slowed down, we've made this procedure transparent. We see now what happens because we have the single steps along the timeline, and we can check what's going on. So this is what's causing the explosion, because dForce doesn't know where to put the fabric. So what can we do? We can tweak the pose in between here. You can make a lot of changes in between these keyframes. The final pose will still be this one. It will have no effect on the final pose. So here in frame 10, it's still okay. There still is a distance between hand and thumb and the hip. So we could change the arm position, but what I like to do in these cases is select this area here, the base of the thumb, and bend it. Now we have a limit here, and I go to parameter settings and switch off this limit, and I bend it all the way here. Now this doesn't look good, but as I said, what is here, what happens here has no influence on the final result, because in this frame, in our final frame in 15, we're still back in the original pose. So this looks good again. This is just a workaround so the thumb doesn't press the fabric into the figure. And now make the dress visible again. Here we go. And run the simulation. As you can see, the slider moves along with the progress of the animation, of the simulation, and this is a good way to find out where the problem is. If you run into an explosion, just look at what position on the timeline it happens and then check this particular frame, because then probably you have a problem like this, like the hand moving through the hip or something. Okay, what we also notice is that this is a little bit too close because the clothing has smoothing applied. So that is not an issue for dForce. dForce can handle a little bit of squeezing between the body parts, but smoothing can't. So just move that out a bit. Here we go. And it's fixed. Right. So we have this pose which we wanted with our workaround in between so the thumb doesn't get in the way. And the final result looks the way we want. There is another issue which also happens frequently. If you look at her legs here, and I move back to default position and scrub the slider along, you can see that the feet actually move through each other. So for the dress, that's not a problem. For pants that go down to the ankle, for long pants, it would be a problem because the fabric would need to move through itself. So if the figure had pants on, this would be another area you need to fix. You would have to use a similar strategy as I used here. For example, move this leg out a bit more so it goes round the ankle here, and then it's back into position in frame 15 again. The rest of the frames are just for draping. You may have noticed if you use the current frame technique, which we used previously, you have a second phase which is called stabilizing the animation, and that is just to give the fabric time to settle into the final position. So that's what I have by setting the main pose in the middle of this range here and giving it another 15 frames to properly drape and reach its final position. You could also apply the pose at frame 10, or you could increase the number of frames to 60, for example, and apply the pose in frame 20, so it has 40 frames to settle. So it always depends on the particular item. Also, read the user guide. Many dForce clothing items come with a default with a guide, with a user guide, or recommended settings like a simulation settings preset in the library. Use these because they will adjust the settings to the best for this particular item. So, for example, this dress can be used with the default settings. Other clothing items may need different settings here, and instead of reading the manual and setting the things manually, you could apply the preset provided by the clothing creator. Also, some clothes just need more time to simulate, to drape, because there are a lot of complex mathematical operations going on in a dForce simulation. So if this time is too short to complete them all, you may run into issues. So just by increasing this rate, for example to 60, and applying the pose in the middle at 30, you give dForce more time to complete the calculations and you will get better results. So if you run into a problem, the first thing to try is increase the number of frames with this option here, with a timeline play range. Let's look at another example. I move this slider back to frame 15 and I go to my content library, and let's move to the all suite poses. That's one of my favorite pose sets. And let's go to this one. And we can see we're going to run into a problem here. Let's clear the previous simulation, and we still have a problem. So let's hide the dress for a moment and let's look at this. So what I have here, I can see it very clearly here and here, also from the back or from the side. The forearms are sticking in the torso. You can see we have this overlap going on here. So this pose is really cute, but it will not work with dForce because, as we said, dForce can't handle the fabric being pressed into the figure. So what can we do? We do have distance between the hip area here and the hands. So that would work. The problem is the forearms. So let's switch the dress on again, and let's use a little trick here. Select the forearm, hold down the control key, select the second forearm. Yeah, we have both selected, and we go here to display, and we deactivate this option here, visible in simulation, off. The rest of the figure will still be visible, also the hands, so they collide properly with the skirt here, but the forearms will be ignored in the simulation. Now let's see if that works. We have some poke through going on here in the armpit area too. So that might be another problem, because this shoulder is also pressing into the torso. So let's just take a risk and let's see what happens. So actually this is not too bad. We have a problem with the hands here. So also you may notice that there is a little movement here because we tweaked a little finger in the previous pose. So this has still, when you select it, you can see it has the black triangle underneath. It has still this keyframe here. So we click the X, the key with the X, that deletes this keyframe here. And I move to frame 10. I can remove this keyframe here for the thumb, and I tweak my hands a bit. I move them out so they don't interfere with the skirt so much. I just bend them away. Let's see. Still a distance. Okay, so that's the effect of the previous simulation. Let's clear that and let's try again. Okay, now I have a bit of a problem with the smoothing modifier because that is not quite sure whether it should wrap the skirt around the forearm or not. So I could go here and just deactivate the smoothing, which creates other problems. So yeah, I could decide now if I want the smoothing, and I fix this perhaps in post-work in the render, or I render it from a perspective where it doesn't really show, perhaps at a distance it's not too bad. On the other hand, yeah, this pose does have a few issues because here is not enough space between arm and torso. Here we have the poke through. Yeah, it's not perfect. It's okay. We made it work in a way, but it's not the best result. So this shows that dForce doesn't do any miracles, but it's pretty good for this problematic pose. It just doesn't work with all poses. So either you adjust the pose, you could move forward the arms a bit, you could adjust the position of the torso, so this part moves forward a bit so we have less poke through here. What is difficult to fix for this hand position is that in Genesis 8, when she moves her arms down, they stick a bit into the torso. So as we've seen, dForce doesn't throw a fit because of it. It doesn't create an explosion, but it certainly has its issues, because you can see here these gaps here will also show in the render. So yeah, it's not perfect, but it depends on each particular case whether this result is acceptable or not. Now let's look at some other special cases. For example, sitting poses. You can make dForce clothing interact not only with a figure, but also with all sorts of props and other figures you have in your scene. For example, when your figure is sitting on a chair. Let's go back to frame 15 and let's select the figure, not the dress. And I go back to my base poses. And let's use this one. Here we go. And instead of a chair, I'm just going to use a cube. And I have to scale it down. For a moment I switch off the dress so I can see better where the figure ends and where the cube starts. So I scale that down and I zoom in. Okay. Yeah, I think that's okay like this. We have a tiny bit of space for the skirt to move between figure and this seat cube. And because that is rather tiny, let's make it a bit wider, like a sort of marble block or stone block where she's sitting on, and let's rotate it a bit. Right. Okay. So switch on the dress again and see what happens when we simulate that. Okay, that worked quite well. We have some problems with the smoothing here because the hand is too close to the thigh, but it doesn't create actual poke throughs, so dForce could handle it. When we look at this sideways, you see that we have a problem here. This hand is too far away from the seat surface. If we look at it without the dress, the pose was probably meant to sink the figure into this block, but that is something dForce can't handle. When the figure is directly inside the seat, you will get an explosion. So we have to settle for this, and we'll just have to tweak the pose. So I select the hand and drag it down a bit. Let's select this one and move it down. That also adjusts the sideways movement of the torso and lifts up this hand, so there's one problem fixed. It's just a bit too far away now. So let's use these sliders to tweak it a bit more. That was too far. And let's move up the thumb a tiny bit. Right. So as you can see, because all dForce clothing, or nearly all dForce clothing, is properly rigged, it's not a problem to make such tiny corrections after the simulation. If you have to tweak the pose a lot, so that it changes the figure's pose too much, then it's better to do that before the simulation. But tiny tweaks like this, like I did now, you can do that after the simulation too. Although that always depends on the clothing too. In this case, it worked fine. One thing you may notice is that the skirt underneath the figure is a little crumpled. That is because when we look at what happens in this animation, she moves just directly down. The skirt collides with the box here, and that's the way it drapes. Okay, what we see now, this weird movement here, that is because we have another keyframe here. So let's select all of the figure again. Remove this keyframe. Go to frame 15. And let's make these corrections again. It's better to make these tweaks in the frame where you apply the pose and not in the final frame, especially if you're planning to work more with this scene. If it's not just, if you then just hit render, then it's okay, but if you're planning to tweak it more to add other elements, or if you want to change the pose, try different poses, then it's always better to make that just in this frame, which will then be changed by the next applied pose. Right. So we have this pose, we keep that. We tweak this seat here a little. First, let's make sure we memorize this, not memorize, we save this as a keyframe, this position here. Then let's move to the 0 frame, and I'm going to move the frame back, the box back. Now, one thing I noticed is that the timeline doesn't always realize it when you use this universal tool for translations of objects. It's always better to use the sliders here. Or just to type in the value you want. I don't know why. Perhaps there is a deeper reason for it. I haven't found it yet. I just noticed that this is the way it is. So what I want to happen is that while the figure is sitting down, this block is moving in, so it is pushing the skirt along, so it doesn't end up squashed like this, but smoother. So I need to wait until the figure is down a bit, so the skirt is around here when the box moves in, so it hits the skirt and moves it forward, not the other way around. I want the box to arrive here and hit the skirt here, not like it is happening now, that the skirt hits the top of the box. So I need to move that a bit further away. And let's clear that. This could work. Let's see. And you can see it moves the skirt towards the front. And now when I look at the result, I have a nicer draping than before. I don't have the skirt crumpled underneath the figure. I have a nice draped shape here. What I also have is a little poke through here. That's probably because the cube is very low res. It's just easier, instead of re-draping this again, just scale it a tiny bit smaller. Here we go. 0.5%. And the poke through is gone, and it still looks nice. You can do that with all sorts of objects, with chairs, beds, whatever. If your figure is sitting on it, in real life, a person with a skirt sitting down, usually they use their hands to arrange the skirt. A 3D figure doesn't do that. You could perhaps set up the simulation so the hands interact with the skirt to smooth it, but I find it easier just to have the furniture move in and drag the skirt into position, like I showed now. So that is a rather handy method to drape the skirt nicely over a chair or any kind of seat. Now let me show you another useful trick for rotations. I'm going to hide the cube. I don't need that at the moment. And I'm going to use a different pose from this collection here. Let's say this one. You can see the figure rotates. I always, when I've changed the pose a few times without creating a new scene, I always check this range here to make sure I don't have any other keyframes that mess up what I want. So I check this pose and it rotates quite a lot. So with this dress, the effect I want to show you probably isn't as noticeable, so I delete that. Or I hide it, I can do that too. And I load a different dress. I load my all seasons dress, the long dress with a belt. Does it drape alright? Yeah. We don't have any hands moving through the body or anything. So this should work fine. As you can see, this is taking longer than the other dress. Because the skirt is longer, it has more geometry, and it just takes longer to drape. This is more than a minute now. 1 minute and 5 seconds. Okay. So you can see that the draping result is not very nice here. When the figure rotated, the fabric picked up a lot of movement, and it doesn't have enough time in these 30 frames to settle back. It would have to rotate in the other direction again and settle down into a neutral position. It doesn't have that time because the simulation stopped earlier. So I could give it more frames, but I can also use another trick, which will also make it drape faster. I select the hip of my figure and I go to the frame 15 where I originally applied the pose, and I see that there is a lot of rotation going on the y-axis, which is the main axis of rotation for the figure. So I select that and I either remember or I copy it. Let's copy it, Control C, and I go to this frame here, and in the same axis, on the Y rotate, I enter that. So now it doesn't rotate anymore. It starts in this position and it just moves into pose without rotating. To make that work in the simulation, I have to deactivate this button here. Now I don't want to start it from the memorized pose, and the memorized pose would be the pose with which the figure loads. This A pose, but without the rotation, the pose we had previously. So to make it start with a rotated figure, I have to switch that off. Actually, when I use the timeline, I often switch that off anyway, because I usually have the neutral position in frame 0 anyway, so there is no need to have that on. Alright, let's simulate that now and see what happens. Okay, this was a tiny bit faster, 1 minute and 2 seconds instead of 1 minute and 5 seconds, but the drape result is much better. To get this result, I would have needed much more frames, so it would have needed twice the amount of time or even longer to get this result. So just by removing this rotation, I have improved the draping result, and I have saved some time. Using a different starting pose comes also in handy for lying or lounging poses on the floor or on beds or wherever. Let's look at an example, and I'll just use this dress again. And I'm going to use a different pose. Let's select Genesis and not her eyelashes. Let's use pose. For example, this one. Perhaps the mirrored version. Right, doesn't really matter. When you want the figure to sit or lie on the floor, you need to give dForce a floor to interact with. What you see here, this checker wireframe, is just the virtual floor to show you where the 0 position is. It's not real geometry that can interact with your clothes. So we need to load some geometry, and instead of a cube, I'm using a plane, and I usually use a 2 meter size. Here we go. And I don't have to do anything more because as I said initially, dForce always collides the clothing with everything that is in your scene, so this plane will be included as a collision object. Now I want to go to my simulation settings, clear the previous simulation, and I go here and I remove the rotation I had previously. So this is the default pose. Just for comparison, let's start with this one and see how it looks. You can see that the fabric moved quite a lot and it's not too nicely draped here. It has this ugly fold, and that happened because when the figure moves down, there is some resistance of the air, so this billows up and it stays in that position when the figure arrives at the floor, and that's the way it settles. So let's see if we can find a better starting position so we get a nicer result. I've the hip selected. Let's go here. Okay, so the hip is much lower down at -88, so let's use that as a starting point in frame 0. Right. What else do I have? I have a rotation here on the x-axis. Let's transfer that. I could also adjust it manually. As we can see, this is not going to work because the dress is sticking inside the plane, and we've already seen that dForce doesn't like things sticking into each other. So let's adjust the rotation. Let's put her like this, and let's move her up a little bit further, like this. Now when she moves into position, it will hopefully look better. So you can see there is not as much movement as there was before when the figure moved down from the standing position to the floor position. Let's simulate that now. Okay, it draped a bit faster, the result is a bit nicer. I could now play with different starting positions. For example, I could start like this, move her up a bit more. So this creates different folds, different draping results here in this area. So just by tweaking the starting position, you can get different results for the fabric. You could also pose the figure in place so it doesn't move up or down, and you could move up the plane. You can animate the plane like I did with the cube for the sitting pose. So the cube moved in from the back, the plane could move in from down towards up. So these are different variations how you could get different draping results. Another very useful feature is the freezing feature. Let's say you want to cover this figure with a sheet. When you drape the sheet over her, dForce will simulate everything at once. It will simulate the dress and it will simulate the sheet you drape over her. So if you don't want that, you can freeze a simulation. Select the dress, go to General, and here we have Freeze Simulation, which is off by default. Switch it on, and now you can add another dForce item and have it collide with the dress in this current state. If you animate along the timeline, it will still move, but it will not recalculate the simulation you've already done here. So if you drape another fabric over here, if you have not activated this, if it isn't frozen, it might mess up the result of the dress. It could move the skirt into a different position and so on. So by freezing it, this will stay exactly as it is, and you can drape something else over her. That's also very useful for layered clothing. For example, if we hide that dress now, and let's use my dForce collection as an example. As you can see in this product, I've even added presets to activate and to freeze the simulation. So let's hide the sandals. Let's delete them. We don't need them at all right now. And let's hide the blouse. Let's run the simulation. In this case, the pants are not simulated at all. The top is simulated. Now I select that, and I can go to my content library and use that preset, or I could go here and switch on this button. And now make that visible again, and I run the simulation again. Here we go. Now if I hide that again, I see that the top has still the shape it had before. These folds are nice and round here. They haven't been squeezed by the additional layer, which probably would have happened if I hadn't frozen the simulation before. So this is a good way to make layers work, because if you simulate everything at once, you might get poked through, it will take longer, you have less control, and this is a good way to handle these problems by simulating everything separately using the freeze feature. Right, so to summarize what I've shown you in this video, we have different methods to do a dForce simulation. We have the current frame, which is the quickest method, but it does not give you a lot of control over the way the figure moves into the final pose. It's better to use the animated method with a timeline where you apply a pose in the middle and you control the starting pose, and you also have full control over what happens in between these two keyframes, so you can always go in and tweak the position of a body part to avoid poke through. We have seen that dForce can't really handle body parts that are sticking into each other, so this is something you would need to fix, and in the worst case you need to choose a different pose or tweak the pose a lot to get rid of these type of poke through, which will cause issues and even explosions of the dForce clothing. You can switch this option on or off. You can decide if you want to start from the memorized pose, which is the default pose in most cases, or whether you want to choose your own starting pose, depending on the pose and the effect you want to achieve. Potential problem areas are armpits and the area here when the arms are moved down, because they often stick into the torso. Hands can be a problem, especially with hands on hips. Make sure you have a little bit of space for the fabric to move between the body and the hands. Also make sure that the thumbs don't stick into the fabric while the figure is moving into the final pose. This can be checked in the timeline, and you can do the necessary fixes around frame 10 or so, wherever it's necessary. When you have a pose with a lot of rotation, you might tweak the starting pose to reduce this rotation to get different draping results, so the fabric doesn't wrap itself all around the figure. Or when you have poses on the floor, you could move the starting pose further down into a lying or half-lying position like here, to get different draping results. And by using different angles, different starting poses, you will always have more control over the final result of the draping. And when you're working with layers, don't forget to use this freeze simulation feature to freeze the bottom layer in place before you add the top layer, because this will give you more control, less poke through, and overall better results. I hope that you found this tutorial useful. I hope that you're feeling more confident with dForce now, that you could use some of my tips, and I wish you lots of fun with your dForce simulations. Bye!